The laugh came first, sharp and careless, like a coin tossed into a gutter. It echoed across the marble lobby of a downtown Chicago bank, cutting through the quiet like a blade. People turned their heads, a security guard stiffened, and a young woman standing at the counter, holding a worn envelope with trembling fingers, froze like she'd been slapped in public. Her eyes didn't flare with anger, they didn't even fill with tears yet. They only carried one desperate, fragile hope as she whispered the words that made the millionaire laugh even harder. She just wanted to see her balance, because to him, she looked like nothing, like someone who shouldn't even be in that building, like a shadow that had wandered into a world of glass and gold. Before we go deeper into this story, take 1 second and tell me something. Do you believe kindness can change a life? If you do, please like this video, comment, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel, because stories like this remind us that second chances are real. Her name was Grace Whitmore, and she had the kind of face that made you think she used to smile a lot, before life taught her to ration joy. Her coat was thin for early winter, her shoes were scuffed, and her hair, chestnut brown, was tied back in a messy knot like she didn't have time to be anything but strong. Grace wasn't here for attention. She wasn't here to beg. She wasn't even here to ask for help. She was here because the last thing her mother ever told her to do was to check. Her mother, Ruth Whitmore, had passed away just 2 weeks earlier in a cramped hospital room on the South Side. Cancer had eaten her quietly, slowly, and cruelly. The bills had stacked like bricks on Grace's chest. She'd sold her mother's wedding ring to cover medication, and when the ring left her palm, it felt like losing her mother twice. Still, Ruth had held on long enough to press a small envelope into Grace's hand. Inside it was an old account number, a note written in shaky handwriting, and one sentence that didn't make sense at the time. "Go to the bank and look, sweetheart. Don't be afraid of what you see." Grace hadn't understood. Ruth had been a cleaner, a night shift janitor at a private office building. She'd never had savings. She'd never had anything extra. Grace herself worked 2 jobs, morning shift at a diner and evening shift as a hotel housekeeper. The kind of work that leaves your back aching and your hands smelling like bleach no matter how hard you scrub. Still, Ruth's eyes had carried a certainty that scared Grace more than death itself. So now Grace stood at the counter of a sleek Chicago bank, trying to breathe while the teller typed in the old account number. Grace's fingers clutched the envelope like it was the last thread holding her life together. Around her, polished people in tailored coats walked with the calm confidence of those who never checked prices. The lobby smelled like expensive cologne and fresh coffee. And then there was him. His name was Nathaniel Cross. Everyone in the city knew that name. Billionaire investor, real estate king, the kind of man whose presence changed the air in a room. He was there that morning with his assistant and 2 lawyers, talking loudly about acquisitions and numbers that didn't even sound real. Nathaniel was tall, perfectly groomed, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Grace's rent. He glanced over when he heard Grace's timid request. Then he laughed. Not because it was funny, but because he could. Grace didn't even look at him. She stared at the teller's face, watching for a reaction. The teller's eyes shifted as if she'd seen something that didn't belong on her screen. Her fingers froze above the keyboard. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. She looked up at Grace with a strange mix of confusion and caution. Grace's heart started pounding hard enough to hurt. The teller leaned forward, voice low. Her expression was no longer neutral. It was careful, almost respectful. She asked Grace to confirm her identity again. Grace handed over her worn ID with shaking hands. The teller scanned it, swallowed, and then glanced over her shoulder toward the manager's office. That was when Nathaniel Cross stopped laughing. Not because he suddenly found empathy, but because he noticed something he rarely did, people's reactions. He saw the teller's pale face. He saw the manager stand up too quickly, like a fire alarm had gone off. He saw the way the security guard shifted closer, not to remove Grace, but to protect her. Nathaniel's smile faded. Grace stood still, feeling like the floor might open beneath her. Her throat tightened as memories crashed into her. Ruth collapsing on the kitchen floor, Ruth apologizing for being sick, Ruth whispering prayers at night. Grace didn't want riches. She wanted relief. She wanted to know she could pay the funeral home. She wanted to stop choosing between rent and groceries. The bank manager came out, a man named Mr. Patterson, his tie slightly crooked like he'd rushed. He approached Grace with an expression that didn't match her appearance. He spoke softly, guiding her away from the counter into a private office. Grace's knees felt weak as she followed him, as if she were walking into a courtroom where her life would be judged. Inside the office, the manager closed the door and offered her a seat. Grace sat, clutching the envelope. The manager's hands trembled slightly as he pulled up the account details. Then he looked at Grace with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for tragedy or miracles. The account, he explained, had been opened decades ago. It had been dormant for years, but not empty. It had been protected, structured, and invested. The balance wasn't small. It wasn't even large. It was staggering. Grace's mind couldn't process the number. Her eyes blurred. It didn't feel like joy. It felt like disbelief so strong it turned into fear. She asked if it was a mistake. The manager assured her it wasn't. The account belonged to Ruth Whitmore, and Grace was listed as the sole beneficiary. Grace's hands went cold. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She thought of her mother scrubbing floors at midnight. She thought of her mother coming home exhausted, hiding coughs behind her sleeve. She thought of how Ruth always insisted on walking Grace to the bus stop as a child, even when the wind cut like knives. None of it made sense. Then the manager added one more detail that changed everything. The account was connected to an old trust established by a family name that Nathaniel Cross himself had been negotiating with for weeks. A name Nathaniel believed was extinct, a name tied to land, inheritance, and an old legal settlement. Ruth Whitmore wasn't just a janitor. She had been hiding something her whole life. And outside that office, Nathaniel Cross had followed. Nathaniel wasn't used to being curious about strangers, but the manager's reaction had disturbed him. So he'd walked closer, pretending to check his phone, and when the office door opened briefly, he caught a glimpse of the screen on the manager's computer. The balance. Nathaniel Cross's entire face changed in 1 second. The color drained, his lips parted, his eyes locked on that number like it was a ghost. He didn't just see money, he saw power. And worse, he saw a threat, because that money meant ownership, rights, control, the very deal he'd been pushing, the land he wanted, the redevelopment project he planned to put his name on like a crown. It could all be stopped by the woman he just laughed at. Grace walked out of the office feeling like she wasn't fully inside her body. The lobby looked different now, brighter, louder, unreal. She held a printed statement in her hands, her fingers trembling so badly the paper fluttered like a wounded bird. Nathaniel stepped forward. For the first time in his life, he looked at Grace not as a background character in his world, but as someone capable of changing his story. He offered a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He spoke with charm, the kind that had closed deals and broken opponents. He congratulated her. He acted impressed. But beneath it all, Grace felt something sharp, predatory. Grace didn't understand the legal details, but she understood people. Years of being underestimated had trained her instincts like a survival skill. And she could feel it. Nathaniel Cross wasn't happy for her. He was calculating her. Grace left the bank quickly, stepping into the cold Chicago air. The wind slapped her cheeks, but she barely felt it. Her mind was spinning. She sat on a bench outside, staring at the paper again and again, waiting for it to turn into a lie. Tears finally came, not soft tears, but shaking, gasping sobs that she tried to hide behind her sleeve. She cried for her mother, for the years of struggle, for the nights she'd gone to bed hungry so Ruth could eat, for the shame of being poor, for the humiliation of being laughed at in a place built for the wealthy, and for the strange, painful truth she couldn't escape. Ruth had known. Ruth had carried this secret like a cross on her back. Ruth had let herself suffer so Grace wouldn't be consumed by greed or hunted by wolves. Grace went home that night to her tiny apartment and sat on the floor, surrounded by bills. For the first time, the bills didn't feel like a death sentence. But she didn't feel victorious. She felt afraid. Because money doesn't just change your life, it reveals the world. And the world can be ugly when it smells new wealth on someone it considers undeserving. The next morning, Grace returned to the diner for her shift. She didn't tell anyone. She poured coffee, wiped tables, and smiled like she always did. But something was different in her eyes, something steadier. Like a person who had been drowning and suddenly touched the bottom, realizing she could push up. Then Nathaniel Cross came in, not dressed like a billionaire, dressed like a regular businessman. He sat in her section like it was an accident, but nothing about him was accidental. Grace approached with her notepad, hands steady. Nathaniel looked up at her like he owned the air. He spoke softly, politely. He offered to help. He suggested she needed guidance. He said she could lose everything if she didn't make smart decisions. His words were wrapped in concern, but Grace heard the message underneath. Let me control this before you learn what you truly have. Grace didn't argue. She didn't panic. She simply nodded, finished taking his order, and walked away. Because that night, after her shift, Grace had visited a small law office on the west side, a modest building with peeling paint. She'd met a lawyer named Thomas Keller, a quiet man with tired eyes and honest hands. She'd told him everything. She'd shown him the papers. Thomas had studied them carefully, then looked at Grace with a seriousness that made her stomach twist. He told her the truth. What she had wasn't just money, it was a legacy. It was land, it was leverage, and people like Nathaniel Cross would not stop until they had it. Grace listened, absorbing every word like oxygen. She didn't know this world, but she could learn. She had learned how to survive. She could learn how to fight. Days turned into weeks. Grace began moving differently. She opened accounts properly. She paid off debts quietly. She arranged her mother's funeral with dignity, giving Ruth the peaceful goodbye she deserved. She donated to the cancer ward where Ruth had spent her last days, leaving no name, just gratitude. She reduced her shifts but didn't quit immediately. She wanted to remain invisible until she understood the battlefield. Nathaniel, meanwhile, grew impatient. He sent offers, then pressure, then veiled threats disguised as legal warnings. Grace's phone rang with unknown numbers. Her landlord suddenly received calls about her. Her diner manager was asked strange questions about her schedule. Grace felt fear creeping in at night, cold and heavy. But every time she felt like folding, she remembered Ruth's face, Ruth's quiet strength, Ruth's sacrifice. Ruth hadn't given Grace money. She had given her freedom. One evening, Grace stood alone at the edge of Lake Michigan, the city lights reflecting on the water like broken stars. She clutched her mother's old cross necklace in her palm. She whispered a prayer into the wind, not for wealth, but for courage. And courage came not as a roar, but as a decision. Grace made her move. She used her legal rights to block Nathaniel's redevelopment deal. She didn't do it out of revenge. She did it because she discovered what the deal would do. Evict families, destroy small businesses, erase neighborhoods that had survived generations of hardship. Ruth had cleaned those buildings. Ruth had known those people. Ruth had lived among them. Grace chose them. When the news broke, it shocked Chicago. Headlines called her the hidden heiress. People dug into Ruth Whitmore's past. They discovered Ruth had once been connected to a wealthy family, but had walked away decades ago after refusing to marry for money. She'd chosen a simple life, a hard life, a life of service. She'd hidden her inheritance, letting it grow quietly, waiting until the right moment. And now, it was in Grace's hands. Nathaniel Cross was furious. He requested a meeting, a final negotiation, this time not at a diner, not at a bank counter, but in a high-rise conference room with a skyline view. Grace arrived wearing a simple navy coat, her hair neatly tied back, her face calm. She didn't dress like a billionaire. She dressed like herself. Nathaniel tried charm first, then intimidation, then mockery. He reminded her of where she came from. He implied she didn't belong in this world. He said she would be crushed. Grace listened quietly, then slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents, legal filings, community development plans, and a proposal. Grace wasn't just blocking him. She was building something better. Affordable housing, scholarships, a community center in Ruth's name, support programs for single mothers, job training, a redevelopment plan that lifted people instead of burying them. Nathaniel stared at the papers like they were written in another language. His jaw tightened. He looked at Grace, truly looked at her, and for the first time he saw what he'd missed. This woman wasn't weak. She was forged. She had been poor, yes, but not powerless. And now that she had power, she wasn't using it to climb above others. She was using it to pull them up. Nathaniel left that room defeated, but more than that, changed. His laughter from the bank haunted him like a stain he couldn't wash out, because he had laughed at someone's desperation, and in doing so, he had revealed the kind of man he was. Grace returned to her neighborhood, standing in front of the diner one morning as the sun rose over the streets that raised her. She looked at the people walking to work, the mothers holding children's hands, the tired faces still trying, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. If this story is touching your heart even a little, please pause for a moment and support the channel. Like this video, share it with someone who needs faith in humanity, and subscribe, because these stories keep kindness alive in a world that tries to kill it. And before the ending, I have one special request. Comment the word grace if you believe God can turn pain into purpose and struggle into strength. Months later, a new building opened on the south side, a community center with a simple sign, the Ruth Whitmore Hope House. Grace stood at the entrance during the opening ceremony, not wearing diamonds, not surrounded by luxury, but surrounded by people, real people, people who hugged her and cried, people whose lives had changed because one woman refused to become bitter. Nathaniel Cross watched from a distance, alone. He didn't approach, he didn't smile, but he didn't laugh either. His eyes were lowered, as if he finally understood something money could never teach. Grace looked up at the sky that day, the wind brushing her face gently, and she whispered the words she wished her mother could hear. She had checked the balance. But what she truly found was something far greater than numbers. She found her mother's love, written in sacrifice, sealed in faith, and delivered right on time.